All right, it looks like new attendees have started to slow. I think we can probably get rolling. We have a lot to cover. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. It's exciting to get to share this report, our birds and transmission report, with you all and to a Western audience in particular. So a couple of housekeeping items first. So this webinar is going to be recorded and shared with all registrants afterwards, along with links to the report and other resources. We're going to do a Q&A at the end, but you have the ability to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function. We'll handle all those at the end, but if a question comes into mind while we're presenting, feel free to use that Q&A function and pop a question in there. Send it to the hosts and panelists, and we'll be able to see it. Okay, so let's get started. My name is John Hayes. I'm the Executive Director at Audubon Southwest. I'm joined this evening by the folks you see here on the screen, members of our climate team, our National Science Program, and the Audubon Rockies office to share and present this important report with you and to share how advancing clean energy and transmission capacity is critical to the future of birds in our communities. So I'm coming to you from my home up here in Placitas, New Mexico, and here I've personally witnessed the detrimental impacts of a warming climate on the birds I love. Right now, the Rio Grande, which we call our ribbon of life through New Mexico, is starting to dry, and it's expected to be dry through Albuquerque by summer's end. This was once a rare occurrence, but it's something we expect every year now as snowpack depletes, temperatures rise higher and faster, and rains come less frequently. The birds notice too. In Phoenix, we've seen a record-breaking summer of heat that's brought the highest overnight lows ever recorded and the longest streak of over 100-degree days that city has ever seen. So the Southwest is really the front line of the climate crisis in the United States, and the science tells us our window for action is narrowing, but the window does still exist. So we need to act quickly to reduce our emissions and transition to clean energy technologies, including our electricity transmission grid, which is what we're here to talk about today. So Audubon understands the urgency of making the critical investments that will prepare the transmission grid to handle a clean energy future. We also understand how important it is to do it in the right way. We're in a unique position to advocate for the electricity grid that birds need, one that will allow for clean energy development while minimizing negative impacts on birds, wildlife, and people. So this report is rooted in our mission to protect birds and represents an important step in the implementation of our flight plan. So go to the next slide, please, Dan. Our flight plan is Audubon's national strategy for bringing birds back. And the commitment to a clean energy build out for birds is core to the mission that has guided our plan development. Our work across the hemisphere is guided by our vision of a future where birds thrive across the Americas because Audubon is a powerful, diverse, and ever-growing force for conservation. And the next slide, please, Dan. So these trend lines are pretty scary to see. We want to ensure that birds thrive across the Americas, but many of you probably saw the Bring Birds Back report published a couple years ago that detailed the loss of 3 billion birds in North America. So this trend line is what we are aiming to change through our collective conservation work, including our work addressing the threat of climate change. So as we implement our strategy, we'll be monitoring and tracking the proportion of priority bird species with improving hemispheric population trends over time. And our goal is to bend this curve back and begin to recover North America's bird life. The next slide, please. So the flight plan recognizes climate change alongside habitat loss as the key drivers of declining bird populations. Audubon's Survival by Degrees report shows that 389 bird species in North America will be at risk of extinction by the end of this century as a result of climate change impacts at the highest warming scenario. So if we hit that 3.5 degree warming scenario, 389 bird species are at risk of extinction. So I'd encourage you all to visit our Survival by Degrees report, which you can find online and on Audubon's website. The cases are laid out really well there. So without urgent actions to address this threat, we face a challenging future for birds, the habitats, and our communities. The impacts of climate change are happening now, right now. In fact, we've seen it affect birds like the pinyon jay, which is a Western bird that the Fish and Wildlife Service is currently considering listing as endangered, as it loses habitat to drought, wildfire, and beetle kill, all factors that are accelerating under a change in climate. Climate change is having an impact right now on the birds we know and love. Let's go ahead to the next slide, Dan. So our flight plan that I referenced earlier lays out a series of 5-year goals, our conservation milestones. These measurable milestones are our focus over the next 5 years in our journey towards bending that bird curve. So these milestones establish where Audubon can achieve the greatest impact and leverage our current and potential strengths. What you're seeing here is our renewable energy milestone. So Audubon is committed to influencing 100 gigawatts of new renewable energy and transmission capacity in the next 5 years. It's about 20 gigawatts per year on average. So just to help you know what those numbers mean, 1 gigawatt is equivalent to the power needed to power approximately 750,000 homes. There are about 240 million homes in the US currently. So to power these homes for the clean energy future, we have to significantly increase the amount of transmission capacity going to them. This is a global challenge and a hemispheric strategy because we've seen passage of significant public resources in the last year, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which makes the current moment in the US one of the best opportunities for making significant impact in the next 5 years. So as we're implementing this strategy, we'll be aligning with our core Audubon values of following the science, working where our bird voice is most needed, and working locally to make space for impacted communities in the planning process. So our report represents an important step in implementation of this strategic plan milestone. Birds in our communities need us to work with urgency to reduce carbon, and one of the most significant obstacles we have to meeting this challenge is our electric grid, specifically our transmission system. Dan, go ahead to the next slide. So here we're looking at some of the content of the report, which you can access and will be shared links with. So when we say transmission, we're talking about the high voltage power lines that carry electricity over long distances from where it's produced to where it's needed. Think of it as an interstate highway for electrons. And much like the interstate system, it was built over the last nearly 100 years for a different set of technologies and a different expectation of capacity. So now as we look to move away from fossil fuels and towards electricity for more of our daily needs, home heating with heat pumps, new electric vehicles, more electric appliances, and those sort of things, we find ourselves at a crisis point when it comes to the climate readiness of this grid. We need a grid for the 21st century, which means major investments in additional capacity and flexibility is what we need as a nation if we're going to reach our emission reduction goals in time to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Nearly 1/3 of all US carbon emissions come from the electric power sector. So moving to clean energy is also the key to decarbonizing the industrial and transportation sectors. So together, electric, transportation, and industrial represents nearly 80% of US emissions, and quickly deploying more renewable assets is critical for climate stabilization in those industries. So next slide, please, Dan. But what we see is that transmission is really the pinch point. There are currently more than 10,000 clean energy projects, about 2,000 gigawatts of power, that are waiting in line in what we call interconnection queues for the go-ahead to proceed with construction. So lack of available transmission capacity to connect clean energy and move it long distances means most of these low-cost clean energy projects are stuck. They can't proceed. Those that can typically wait an average of 5 years in queues. The vast majority are canceled, meaning they never get built. Earlier this year, Department of Energy conducted a national transmission needs study and found a pressing need for additional electric transmission infrastructure across the country. This map helps put the scope of the problem in focus. So the white dots represent the entire existing transmission grid. Each dot is 1,000 gigawatt miles. So it's taken us nearly 100 years of transmission deployment to build the white dots. The yellow dots are what the DOE study estimates we will need to build in the next 12 years to reach the US goal of 95% clean energy by 2035. So considering that it currently takes an average of 10 to 15 years to plan, permit, and build a new transmission process, the task ahead is very daunting. In fact, if the pace of transmission deployment remains unchanged, analysis shows that the emissions reductions potential created by the passage of last year's landmark climate legislation falls by 80%. So we have a lot of transmission capacity to build, and we have to learn how to do it faster than we ever have and learn to do it better at the same time. So this challenge is what prompted us to initiate the report. To protect birds in our communities from the dangers of global temperature increase, we need to invest in more clean energy generation and transmission. We also need to deploy new infrastructure in ways that support long-term sustainability of bird populations, limits impacts on critical habitats, uses bird-friendly technologies, and includes community voices in the planning process. We don't have to choose between new transmission capacity and bird habitat. We can do both. So to help give us some more regional context to the conversation here, I'm joined by Dolly Edmonds, who is our Audubon Rockies Office Policy and Outreach Director. Take it away, Dolly.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everybody. Again, I'm Dolly Edmonds, and we're just going to take a brief step away from the Birds and Transmission Report. And I'm going to provide a bit of a background, some foundational information about how transmission systems in the U.S. operate. The U.S. bulk transmission system is a complex network of independently owned and operated power plants and transmission lines. Extra high voltage connections between individual utilities permit the transfer of electrical energy from one part of the network to another. So as electricity is transmitted over long distances, there are inherent energy losses along the way as electricity flows from one location to the next. That is the major reason why electricity is transmitted at high voltages, because doing so increases efficiency. This system is also referred to as the power grid, which has evolved into 4 major electric system networks that serve the US and Canada, shown in the map in front of you. These move electricity around the country. The 3 networks in the US are the Eastern Interconnected System, the Western Interconnected System, and that's where we're sitting, and that's for the states west of the Rocky Mountains, and finally the Texas Interconnected System. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is the U.S. federal agency, part of the Department of Energy, that regulates the interstate transmission of electricity across the entire country. Now, for us in the West here, it's the Western Electrical Coordinating Council, or WEC, that is the regional entity responsible for the Western interconnection. Next, please. And again, that's the West that we're looking at. So now let's take a little bit closer look at the Western interconnection. It serves a massive population of over 80 million people and spans 1.8 million square miles, which, as you can see from the maps, encompasses all or part of 14 states, the Canadian provinces of British Columbia and Alberta, and the northern part of Baja California and Mexico. The Western interconnection is made up of about 136,000 miles of transmission lines, shown there on the map on your right. 2 features distinguish the flow of electricity in the West from that in the East. In the West, we have long, high voltage lines that were built to connect remote generating resources to distant population centers. For example, the areas in the US where sunlight and wind are most intense, say the desert Southwest for solar and Montana, Wyoming for wind, are distant from the metropolitan areas where there's most demand, as you can see from the map on your left there. In addition, in the West, what also is different from the East is that we have these other lines that carry power from hydroelectric resources in the Pacific Northwest to California and other states. Because of these uniquely supply and demand patterns, utilities in the West rely more heavily on electricity transported over really long distances than utilities in the East. So to get to the point of where you get a transmission line built, it requires planning, financing, permitting, and siting. That's determining the location, the actual location of the line. These latter 2 pieces are where Audubon has historically been very engaged. But what we also do is a lot of planning, and we're going to be doing that more going forward. Next slide, please. So when we think about Audubon's role in advocating for birds, our work has long been based on science and using the best available science. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Nat Seavey. He is the Director of Migration Science for National Audubon Society, and Nat is going to talk about our current understanding of birds and transmission lines.
Thank you, Dolly. And could I have the next slide, please? So I wanted just to start by reiterating why we need this investment in transition. And Audubon science shows that 2/3 of North American bird species are at risk of extinction from climate change. And if we act on climate change now, we can help improve the chances for 76% of those species. But in order to make that transition to renewable energy happen, we need to have 2 to 3 times the current transmission capacity to achieve our climate goals. Next slide. So Fortunately, there's been a lot of recent science that's gone on that's been focused on trying to understand what the impact of transmission is on birds, and then what we can do in order to reduce the negative impacts of that transmission on birds. And that's what I'd like to talk about tonight, is how that science helps lead us toward better siting and design of transmission. Next slide. So one of the things I wanted to start with was going back to that distinction that John made between distribution lines and transmission lines. So distribution lines are the smaller lines that carry electricity along our streets to our homes. And then the transmission lines are those super highways that are on the tall towers that are carrying the electricity long distances. So one of the distinctions between here that's important is those smaller distribution lines have some unique risks associated with them. And one of them is that because the lines are close together, there's a risk of electrocution that's important to consider for birds. Now, with the transmission towers, those lines are spaced far enough apart that electrocution is not a major issue. And so tonight, what I'll be talking about are the issues that we are primarily concerned about with transmission, and that is collision risk, and then also the risk of habitat degradation and disturbance. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about collision. And as I do that, I wanted to try to put it in context about some of the other sources of avian mortality. So right now, the estimates are that someplace between 1.8 and 5.4 billion bird deaths in the US each year are attributed to human activities or infrastructure. And that accounts for a number of different sources of mortality. So the estimate for collisions with transmission lines are estimated to account for about 8 to 57 million of those deaths each year. So to kind of give that even a little bit more context of other sources of collisions, so if we compare that upper end of the estimate, so 57 million, to the lower end of the estimate for collisions with building glass and deaths from those collisions, that estimate is 365 bird deaths per year, 365 million bird deaths per year. And likewise, that 57 million number is below the lower estimate for the number of birds that are killed by collisions with vehicles on roadways each year, and that's estimated to be 89 million deaths per year. So the other thing to think about that 8 to 57 million number is that that's based on research that has happened on the transmission infrastructure that we have right now. And in a lot of cases, that might be decades old and was built prior to the best practices being established to reduce collision risk. So as we look forward, there's a huge opportunity to have transmission that's got a lower risk of mortality to birds because we're putting the best practices in place. So the question then becomes, what kind of information do we need to understand those risks and how we can avoid them? Next slide. So one of the things that we've learned a lot about is the characteristics that make birds vulnerable to collision. And some of those aspects are the morphology of the bird's eyes and their wings that make different species vulnerable. So some species have eyesight that is not well, it doesn't allow birds to perceive the wires, and it's easy for them to collide with them. And those include some birds like cranes, waterfowl, and game birds. And then there's other species that have wing characteristics that tend to make their flight to be fast and not necessarily maneuverable. And those are species, again, cranes, egrets, and shorebirds. So those are morphological characteristics that we're learning about that we know make these species vulnerable to collisions. Next slide, please. There's also some behavioral characteristics that make birds vulnerable to collisions as well. So migratory movements are one of the things, especially if those migratory movements are happening during the night. Frequent movements between feeding and roosting trips. And again, with those trips, if they are happening at night, that puts birds at greater risk of collision with transmission lines. And then there's finally some other behaviors like traveling in flocks, and also some hunting behaviors, for instance, the aerial hunting of falcons, that high-speed chases that make them vulnerable to collisions as well. And again, some of these species that have these behavioral characteristics that make them vulnerable also share those morphological characteristics. So for instance, you see cranes and waterfowl here being some of the species that have those behavioral characteristics that make them vulnerable. So when we think about transmission, one of the things that this allows us to do is identify the characteristics that make species vulnerable, and then build an understanding of what species those are, where they spend their time, where they're moving across the landscape, and then making sure that we're using that information to inform the siting and design of transmission that will reduce the risk of collision. Next slide, please. So another risk associated with transmission line is the risk of habitat degradation and disturbance. And so when we think about habitat degradation and disturbance, it can happen through a number of different ways. It happens through the construction and maintenance of transmission lines that can disturb and fragment habitat. That activity can attract predators and cause displacement due to human activities. And one of the things that makes this really challenging is that those impacts can vary dramatically between species or between different sites. And so it's important that we're thinking about the local information that goes into understanding which species will be vulnerable to habitat degradation and disturbance. Sage grouse are one of the species that we know are extremely sensitive to some of these different aspects of disturbance, whether it's predators or changes in the skyline, for the species that needs wide open spaces. And then conversely, there may be some species like some of the hawks and eagles, ravens, that use transmission towers as places to nest. And then there also may be opportunities to manage the vegetation below transmission lines in a way that provides habitat for birds. So this is especially true in the northeastern United States, where early successional habitat, so young shrubs and trees, are important nesting habitat for a number of at-risk birds. And there's an opportunity to use the right-of-ways beneath the lines to be managed for the vegetation that will support those species. So again, we've got this incredible growing body of information that allows us to think about what species are vulnerable to collisions, what are the impacts on habitat degradation and disturbance that we need to be concerned with, and use that to make decisions about how we're designing and siting transmission in order to reduce the impacts. So next slide, please. So one of the exciting aspects of the work we do is that we've got a lot of great tools that are available now to think about where are the high priority areas where we need to engage really carefully in transmission siting in order to make sure that we're reducing those potential negative impacts. And so I'll talk a little bit about what some of those sites are, what some of those tools we have are, and how we're able to overlap that with the information about transmission lines to start to make some decisions about where are the high priorities for engagement. Next slide. So two of these resources that we have that do a great job of identifying important landscapes for birds are our climate strongholds and full annual cycle prioritizations. So the climate strongholds prioritizations use information about how climate characteristics impact bird distribution, and then they use that information to identify the important places for resident and migratory birds today, and also where we expect those places to be in the future. And by combining that information, we can identify the strongholds which will carry birds forward into the future. The other thing that we have are the full annual cycle prioritizations for migratory birds. And what those do is combine information that's been generated from tracking migratory birds, from banding re-encounters, and from the distributional maps that we have that have been made available through eBird. All of that information, combining it together and helping us understand where the important places for migratory birds are across their full annual cycle as they move across the hemisphere. Next slide, please. So what we've done is combine these two resources together into an integrated bird prioritization map that allows us to think about where are these important places for migratory and resident birds, both now and into the future. And this pulls in a lot of different bird species and provides us with a single summary that we can use to start identifying these broad geographies that we want to look at more carefully. Next slide. So then we can combine that with information on the power grid. And we've done that for both the existing transmission lines and then also looking forward to the transmission lines that are planned or potentially on the books for future development. And so that provides us a way to match these two pieces up. Next slide. So I'm going to show you now a couple of different maps that show co-occurrence of the priority bird areas with that transmission system. And so what we did, we assessed this on a 50-kilometer hexagon cells. And we did it in two different ways. So we did it in one sense where we were overlapping those high priority areas with all existing and planned transmission lines and using that as an estimate of transmission line density. And we did that for existing and planned transmission to get an assessment of the places where we might be concerned about the risk of collision. So recognizing that both the existing lines and the planned ones together define that future risk surface. The other thing that we did was we thought about the habitat degradation and disturbance piece of it. And for this, we really focused on the planned and potential transmission lines, thinking that these were places where active construction has the biggest potential to change the landscape out there. And then we also did something else we looked at whether or not those planned and potential transmission lines were within existing right-of-ways. And those are places that already have transmission lines in place. And those areas have some greater flexibility about the ability to potentially improve those lines or use the areas that have already been disturbed rather than disturbing new areas. And so I'll show you a little bit about that as well. So next slide there. So this is the map for thinking about collision. And just to walk you through what's on this map. So all of what look like circles are really those 50-kilometer hexagons, and they're different sizes. The bigger they are, the more important they are for birds. So they're coming up more important in that integrated prioritization that I showed you. And then the color that's overlaid with that represents how much overlap there is within that hexagon with the transmission line density. And so the moving from orange to red to dark red goes to greater and greater overlap. So what you're looking for this are big hexagons that are darker red colors. And those are in places that are important for birds and have a lot of overlap with those transmission lines. And those are places where we ought to be concerned about the risk of collision with transmission lines and think about what we need to do to engage in those areas to make sure that we're reducing those potential negative impacts. So you can take a look and you can see there are some places that really pop out up in Washington State, down in Southern California, around some of the Great Lakes, in Wyoming and the center of the country there, and then out in New England. So just kind of trying to take a look at that because some of these patterns are going to shift when we move into the next map that shows the patterns for the risk of habitat degradation and disturbance. So here's this map, and you'll note that there is a lot less red and orange on it. And the reason that is because now we're just looking at the overlap with the potential and planned lines. So a lot of what you were seeing before was from those existing lines. You can see some areas that start to pop out in the Southwest, in that Wyoming region again, some a little bit up in the New England states. And then you can see that there's some cells that are outlined where the hexagons are outlined in black. And those are the ones where there is proposed work in areas with no current right-of-way. And so those are areas where we'd be really concerned about if they overlapped with the important areas for birds, because it would be completely new construction in an area that has a high risk of conflict. And you can see that in a lot of cases, there's relatively few of those that overlap with those colored circles. So a lot of the overlap we're seeing here are in places where there already are existing lines. And that opens up a lot of exciting opportunities about being able to co-locate lines, being able to enhance things, existing lines that are already out there, and other ways of taking advantage of those changes. So in summary, we'll go to the next slide. I wanted to end with these two species here. So one is the common loon, and that's a species that's highly climate vulnerable. And we know that in its breeding range, it's at risk of being pushed out of the United States by changing climatic conditions. And so the other one is the sandhill crane. And that's one, as I've talked through, behavioral characteristics, its morphological characteristics, its flight behavior, all of these things add up to make this species vulnerable to collisions with transmission lines. And looking forward, our challenge and our opportunity is to ensure that we're transitioning to renewable energies in a way that will address climate change and make sure that we have common loons here in the future, and also protect sandhill cranes and make sure that we've got those species that could potentially be negatively impacted by transmission lines in here in the future as well. So to talk more about some of the work that Audubon's doing to make sure that that happens, I'm going to turn this over to Gary George, who's the director of Audubon's Clean Energy Initiative.
Thanks, Nat. That was great. And hello, everybody. How you doing? My team and I at the Clean Energy Initiative advocate on siting and operating of clean energy, as well as transmission projects across the U.S. And we do that through engagement and advocacy on planning, permitting, and priority projects. So, but we've been at Audubon been engaging on transmission in the West and birds for a while, and identifying transmission corridors on public lands, advocating on projects, and using Audubon science that you just heard about. As early as 1989, we were crucial in forming the Avian Powerline Interaction Committee, or APLIC, APLIC, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and utilities. And APLIC is still operating today with perhaps the best guidances for avoiding and minimizing impacts for birds, not only on power lines, but also on transmission lines. So for example, next slide, please. Here's some of the best management practices that have been developed at APLIC that we advocate for proactively as we plan transmission, or as transmission is planned by agencies. Route planning, for instance, line configuration is very important. Also after the build, and we ask for this to be included in the operating of the transmission projects, there could be flight diverters, lights on the lines, multiple lines with flight diverters of different kinds. Also, we ask for habitat management and vegetation plans for these transmission projects. Next. For example, there was and I'll let John Hayes talk about the ultraviolet lights that were developed at Audubon's Rose Sanctuary. So I'm turn it back to John Hayes. Thank you, John.
Sure, thanks, Gary. So along with Gary's help and John Bielak, who's on Gary's team as well, our climate team at Audubon, we work directly with companies, just like Gary said, to try to approach project by project work to try to make these projects better, try to make them more bird friendly. So one that has received considerable attention, has been a little controversial to say the least recently, is the proposed SunZia Southwest Transmission Project. So this project comprises two planned 500 kV transmission lines. Those are big lines carrying a lot of electricity, located across approximately 520 miles of federal, state, and private lands between central New Mexico and central Arizona. So this project will enable up to 4,500 megawatts. That's about 4.5 gigawatts of renewable energy from wind projects in New Mexico to markets in Arizona and California. That's enough energy to power over 2.5 million homes and meet over 10% of Audubon's climate goal of well-sited and operated clean energy projects to protect our birds from warming. So the project, combined with the associated wind projects that it's servicing, is the largest infrastructure energy project ever with an investment of $8 billion. So the project hasn't been without real challenges along the way, and I want to be very clear about that. We hold this up as an example of what can be done when we work with industries and agencies to make projects better, but it doesn't mean that's an easy process and doesn't mean there weren't mistakes made along the way. So Audubon Southwest has been engaged with this project since its inception. Some of our Arizona audience might know the name Tice Saplee on my team. She was engaged in the initial planning all the way up until 2015 to propose changes to the route and to avoid important bird areas around the San Pedro and implement more bird-friendly construction and mitigation techniques, many of which were adopted later. But it was a challenge to get those things incorporated in the early plans. In New Mexico, the early plans had the line cross the Rio Grande in an area that would have seen a very high risk of crane collision directly between Bosque del Apache and Sevieta National Wildlife Refuges. So for all these reasons combined, Audubon was in opposition to the line and had a contentious relationship with the operator for a long time. But in 2018, Pattern Energy took over development of Sunzia, and through Audubon's long relationship with Pattern on their wind projects and on the board of the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, it gave us the company confidence to reach out to us, our New Mexico team, and our Clean Energy Initiative. And at that point, my office started convening our conservation stakeholder partners in regular sessions with the company to inform a new route in New Mexico that would incorporate recommendations from Audubon and our other stakeholders, and that would avoid, minimize, and mitigate for conflicts with wildlife and the places wildlife needs by following the mitigation hierarchy of impact, which includes avoiding first, minimizing second, and providing effective compensatory mitigation third if you can't avoid or minimize. So go on to the next slide, Dan. So over the last 5 years, we've worked closely with Pattern, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the BLM, prioritizing our expertise and recommendations on conservation of birds, particularly sandhill crane, which do use this corridor and are at risk. Yellow-billed cuckoo and southwestern willow flycatcher, all of which find their homes along our southwestern rivers. So our ability to work with Pattern on the design of the project made the project better. And here's some of the ways we did that. So at our urging, a thorough analysis of the benefits and drawbacks of overground and underground crossing of the Rio Grande was conducted, which is something we encourage projects to undertake across the country whenever sensitive river crossings are considered. The project now parallels the Western Spirit Line where it crosses the Rio Grande and is co-located with an existing transmission line as it crosses the Sevieta Refuge. So that co-location is exciting because by upgrading the existing line to hold the Sunzia line, they're actually going to reduce the number of poles needed to support it, having the effect of reducing the energy footprint on the refuge from what it currently is. Also, we've given significant input into the mitigation package that's been developed, which truly goes above and beyond what was required by the agencies. So the mitigation includes 700 acres of high quality conservation land with 500 acre feet of senior water rights that will get donated to the refuge system along the Rio Grande in New Mexico. Also, experimental telemetry tracking of sandhill cranes in Arizona and New Mexico to understand where they be at most risk of conflict and collision with the lines to determine where to concentrate avian flight diverters and monitoring. And then avoidance and minimization of impacts on riparian nesting and migrating species before and after construction of the lines crossing the Rio Grande and San Pedro River. So at our urging, they've implemented helicopter installation, work to avoid new roads, or actually restoring old roads in the canyon crossings that are the most sensitive. And then mitigation for things like saguaro cactus in Arizona are going to happen at a 3-to-1 rate in many cases. So every unsalvageable saguaro that's disturbed, they'll replace 3-to-1. Go ahead to the next slide, Dan. And then one of the things we're excited about as well is experimentation with ultraviolet light technology that Gary mentioned. So this is a system, the ACAS systems that was developed at Audubon's Roe Sanctuary that's been shown to reduce mortality of collision by sandhill cranes by up to 90%. So the New Mexico route has been approved by BLM to construct along with these ACAS system deployed with it. So the Arizona route with amendments was approved a long time ago by the BLM. Arizona Corporation Commission some time ago. The New Mexico route has been approved. And after working with the company, National Audubon made the decision to support this project and see our proactive engagement as a model going forward for our engagement and rapid deployment of well-sited and operated transmission of clean energy. So if you want to learn more about why we support the project, you can check out this blog at our Audubon website that Dan will put in the chat. And then I'm happy to answer any questions specifically about SunZia when we get to the Q&A session as well. So for now, though, I'll hand it over right before we get to Q&A to Gary Moody to talk about some of the policy implications of this work. Gary, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, John. And hi, everyone. Happy to be with you tonight. As John said, my name is Gary Moody, and I am Director for State and Local Climate Strategy for National Audubon. My home base is in Little Rock, Arkansas, where I've worked with Audubon for almost 9 years. And I currently have the privilege to lead our transmission policy and advocacy work. So in addition to working directly with transmission developers, like the SunZia case study that John just talked about, it's also important for Audubon to engage directly in the policy and advocacy arena. So tonight, I want to share with you where and how we as an organization are leaning in on transmission policy by discussing the 7 priority policy objectives that were covered in the Birds in Transmission report. Next slide, please. First, we want to maximize the effectiveness of the existing grid. The most bird-friendly way to quickly increase available transmission capacity is to make sure that we are squeezing the most juice out of the infrastructure that we already have. This includes wide-scale deployment of a suite of technologies called grid-enhancing technologies, or GETs for short, and advanced operation practices. If fully utilized, these policies can dramatically increase transmission capacity without requiring building new lines. Some examples include dynamic line ratings, which measure how much a power line can handle using real-time local weather conditions to calculate a line's capacity rather than the current prevailing practice of relying on static, average, or even worst-case weather assumptions. Advanced power flow controls are another solution that allow grid controllers to push or pull power away from overloaded circuits and onto underutilized corridors within the transmission network. Reconductoring existing lines is another solution, which is shown in the image here. By replacing traditional steel core wire cables with newer advanced conductors with carbon or composite cores, we expect capacity gains ranging from 50 to 150%, and efficiency improvements from 25 to 40%. And they have another advantage of being more impervious to sparking potential fires and other hazards. And finally, and very importantly, a number of you have already asked about this tonight, maximizing what we call non-wire solutions like distributed energy, microgrids, energy storage, rooftop solar, and all distributed resources where available can be a cost-effective option to eliminate the need for new lines. And so we want to be clear in our support for transmission that it's not an either or. If we're going to meet our climate goals in time, it's going to take both. Currently, those new technologies and practices, though, are often underlooked and undervalued in a lot of planning processes around the country. And Audubon believes they should be fully and impartially considered. There's evidence that taken together, these programs could reach nearly half of the new transmission capacity we need by 2035. Next, Audubon will also work to maximize the use of existing rights of way. To the greatest extent possible, new transmission capacity should be planned and sited in areas with co-locating opportunities to maximize the use of existing rights of way that avoid negative community and environmental impacts, including existing transmission, rail, highway, and pipeline rights of way, as they will maximize the speed of deployment while minimizing habitat disruption. As this image illustrates, it's also important that planning for new transmission capacity should strive to build fewer, higher capacity lines in order to minimize the amount of new right-of-way acreage needed. This also saves a lot of money and can be accomplished with better forecasting of anticipated future needs rather than the current practice of relying on building just enough for now, as we do in our current planning models. Next slide. Improving transmission planning processes is another major priority. It's very hard to get a good result from a broken process. The current state of our transmission planning processes is an inefficient, complex matrix of overlapping authorities that often stand in the way of timely and efficient transmission deployment. Therefore, Audubon supports creating more robust transmission planning processes that employ at least a 20-year planning time horizon, use multi-scenario analysis, incorporate early and meaningful stakeholder input, utilize public funding to support participation from impacted communities, and which appropriately balance conservation and community impacts with the need to rapidly increase our transmission capacity. This map illustrates the quite gerrymandered transmission planning regions across the country and was developed by our partners at Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, who were nice enough to let us borrow it for this report. As you can see, no one in the country is doing A-grade work, and many parts of the country, including wide swaths of the Western interconnection, have vast room for planning improvements. We will also need a stronger transmission role for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, in setting national standards for transmission planning, siting, and permitting, and serving as an arbiter when states and regions cannot agree. FERC's continued push for improved transmission planning requirements is critical to meet the scale and time constraints required to reach U.S. emission reduction goals and to create the safer, more resilient grid that our changing climate demands. Over the last year, Audubon has engaged in a number of FERC rulemakings, including the recent interconnection queue rule released just a few weeks ago. While we're seeing largely positive steps, FERC needs to continue their emphasis on grid enhancing technologies, complete the regional transmission planning reform rule, and move forward with their other rulemakings, including establishing federal backstop permitting authority to speed the deployment of transmission. This type of national leadership is essential if we're going to meet the scale and scope of the challenge. Next slide. And FERC isn't the only game in DC. We also need to secure other federal transmission policy reforms. Audubon will engage with the Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, and Congress to advance policies that facilitate faster transmission deployment by leveraging federal investment, streamlining rules for federal siting, and encouraging private capital to invest in transmission. We list a number of specific opportunities of interest in the report. We also need to prepare states for more transmission deployment. States play a very important role in approving and permitting transmission projects, yet very few have dedicated transmission authorities. Notably, 2 of the states are here in this region in Colorado and New Mexico. But in most states, these processes are relegated to other state agencies that are largely overworked and understaffed. We find that many are unable to keep pace with the current rate of transmission deployment in a timely manner, much less the more than double-paced rate of deployment required to meet our needs. While all states are unique, certainly some additional states would be well served to create dedicated state transmission authorities, and all would benefit from the full utilization of recently passed federal funding available through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide. And finally, of course, we will continue to advocate for bird-friendly transmission design and operations. As Nat and Gary George and John all covered earlier, bits and pieces of this, I want to make sure not to be repetitious and save time for your questions. But it is important to note that building on the science and our direct work and experience gained by engaging with transmission developers to encourage the voluntary adoption of siting and management best practices, Audubon will also actively look for ways to integrate both requirements and incentives for these practices into transmission policies where and when we are able. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. And I'm going to hand it back over to John, who will moderate Q&A with all of the panelists. John?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So just a reminder, we are going to share the recording and the report in an email afterwards that you all will get. There's also links to all the materials we referenced in the chat still. And also just to put a plug in for questions, both Gary and Nat that we all heard from are all co-authors of this report. So we've got the expertise right here in the moment with them to make sure we can ask any burning questions that you have. Like I said, I'm happy to answer questions that are directed towards me. So you can use the chat Q&A function in the webinar to submit a question to hosts and panelists by clicking the icon in the lower center of your screen. And you can address it specifically to one of us if you like, or just type a general question and we'll do our best to assign it to the right person. I can't guarantee we will get to every question, but especially if you direct them to a specific person, we will follow up afterwards with answers. So we do have some questions in the queue. Dolly, I've got one I'd send your way. I think you'd be great to answer. How do you convince politicians and other people why it is necessary to protect birds? From Luis. And later she asks, how'd you get the BLM to work with you? And I can touch on that if you don't have anything there, but yeah, do you have an answer there, Dolly?
Yeah, I think, well, the first part is the fact that folks are taking part of their evening right now and being informed and learning about what's happening is huge. A description or a statement that's always stuck with me is if people don't know about something, they can't care about it. And it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you may be sitting on. I can guarantee you folks have stories about birds that what is their favorite species, I think and that really brings us together. And so I think just starting conversations, building relationships with politicians, and that's what Audubon tries really hard to do. We talk to folks across both sides. I think we have more in common than not. And then when we think about birds really bring us together. When birds are not doing well, they are an indicator that our communities are not doing well, the environment's not doing well. And so I think being able to use birds as an indicator species as well as bringing us together is really powerful. So hopefully that answered your question. And then John, if you want to tackle the Bureau of Land Management question.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. In the case of this, in the SunZia project, where we worked with giving technical guidance to BLM directly, they actually approached us to hear our perspective and get our input. I think that's a testament to, for one, the current administration and their interest in working with the environmental community, but also the growing and historic reputation of Audubon and our interest in finding solutions on these challenging problems. BLM is comfortable coming to us because they know that we will work with them to try to get to solutions, to try to get to yes, to try to make these projects better. And we've been I think hopefully a valuable source for them. So there's another question which I will summarize as could we have done a better job at Audubon Southwest of consulting with local partners on the SunZia transmission line, in particular in southeastern Arizona and around the lower San Pedro Valley? And I think the answer there is yes. I think it's a challenge for us to hear from all voices and to make sure that we're connecting with every community where we work, but we do make it a priority and we want to do a better job of it. In this case, in particular in southeastern Arizona, we do lean heavily on our relationship with Tucson Audubon. And so a lot of the conversations that happen through our relationship with the chapter. And so we get input locally from the chapter. And honestly, on SunZia, we haven't always been aligned with Tucson Audubon, and that's fine. Family members disagree at times, right? But we do want to make sure that we're an open book when we talk about this stuff, and that our intentions are known and our reasons are explained and justified. So I'm happy to talk to anyone if they want to reach out direct and talk more about our position. So Deborah asks, why aren't existing power corridors like interstate highways being used instead of pristine area wildlife like the San Pedro River Valley? not a big fan of us supporting that project. So, I think we, just like with where we saw SunZia co-locate with existing transmission corridors, existing transmission lines, same goes for highways and the like. We do want to see all those align wherever we can through infrastructure and transportation corridors. But quite honestly, those are quite often pretty challenging places to locate lines as well, because there's siting considerations around different land ownership, airspace, and all those things. If you talk to the industry about their challenges with siting, and they would say that they're trying to thread a needle in most projects. And I don't think we should, that's a reason for us to make it any easier on them. But I think there is some truth that most corridors, whether you know it or not, there's a Department of Defense maybe overlay that says you can't go into that corridor, or there is a critical habitat designation or something like that. And so it ends up becoming pretty complicated. The other thing we want to make sure we're not doing, quite often the interstate system, given the era in which it was put in place, inequitably impacted certain communities. And I don't think we necessarily want to pile on that. You quite often see lower income, lower service communities with interstates running through them. And we don't really want to support putting a bunch of power lines through them either now. So I don't know, maybe some of my other panelists might have a comment there, but I'll check some other questions too.
I would just add to that, John, that it's, in some cases there are opportunities to do that, to utilize highway rights of way, but it's a complicated process. We are part of a national group that is specifically focusing on that issue. And we have seen some progress in a handful of states, but it's just now starting to catch on, right? And so, even though they're interstate highways, the state kind of controls and manages those rights of way, and you have to have permission of both in order to make it work. So yeah, don't write it off. There are some places where that might be feasible, but right now it's just something that we're still working on.
So a couple of a list of questions from Priscilla about some of the specific design features, and we are approaching the end here. We will follow up wherever we can with email correspondence to folks whose questions don't get answered. But a question, maybe a little lightning round, is the UV light being suggested for wind turbines too? I'm not sure if that ACAS system works on wind farms as well. It's an interesting question. It's right now, I think it is more closely focused, and the only real testing has been done in the power lines, right, Gary?
Yeah, and I can jump in real quick, because as Nat said, you look at the morphology and the way that birds see it. Sandhill cranes see things differently. They tested that on golden eagles. They thought, oh, well, they'll be great. We'll light up the turbines for golden eagles. Golden eagles can't see them. So they have a different way of seeing. So it didn't work on golden eagles for wind, but it could work perhaps on sandhill cranes at night or early in the morning.
And then there's another question, and could you mention, Gary, some of the technology we've encouraged related to wildfires, reducing the risk of wildfires from transmission lines?
Gary George?
Yeah, I was thinking you, Gary George. I think there were some examples from California that you've referenced.
Yeah, well, there is in terms of vegetation management is one big part of it, and also there is now some undergrounding in those areas to avoid wildfires, which would also avoid bird strikes that cause wildfires. So that's another method that's being tried out in California.
Okay, so we are up against our time. Thank you all for attending. Concludes our presentation for the evening. I know we threw a lot of information at you in a short time, so we appreciate the time you took to join us. If you haven't had a chance to see the full report, you can use the link in the chat or find it on our website. Just go to audubon.org. And finally, if you have additional follow-up directly for our clean energy initiative, you can always email them at cleanenergy@audubon.org, clean energy, all one word. Okay, thank you again for your time and attention tonight, and have a wonderful evening.